Here is a trait that, on paper, should have erased itself from the human species thousands of years ago. It tends to reduce the number of children a person has. In the cold arithmetic of evolution, that is the one thing a trait is never supposed to do, because a characteristic that lowers reproduction should shrink, generation by generation, until it vanishes. And yet it hasn't vanished. It appears in every human culture ever studied. It has been recorded on every inhabited continent, in every era of recorded history. And it shows up, in one form or another, in hundreds of other species, from penguins to sheep to our closest primate cousins. Same-sex attraction is one of the most persistent, most universal, and most stubbornly unexplained traits in all of human biology. So the question isn't really the one people usually ask. The interesting question isn't whether it's natural, the evidence on that is overwhelming. The question is stranger, and much harder. Why does it keep happening? What in our biology produces it? And why hasn't nature ever bred it away? For most of history, this wasn't treated as a scientific question at all. It was treated as a moral one, or a medical one, something to be judged, or diagnosed, or cured. That framing collapsed under its own evidence in the 20th century. In 1973, after reviewing the research, the American Psychiatric Association removed homosexuality from its Manual of Mental Disorders. It simply did not meet the definition of an illness. It caused no inherent distress, no impairment of function. The World Health Organization followed in 1990. But removing something from a list of disorders doesn't explain where it comes from. And that left biologists with a genuine puzzle. Because sexual orientation is not rare, depending on how it's measured. A few percent of people across populations report predominantly same-sex attraction, a figure remarkably stable across very different societies. Anything that common and that consistent usually has deep biological roots. So scientists went looking for those roots in the genes, in the womb, in the structure of the brain, and in the behavior of animals who could not possibly have been influenced by human culture at all. What they found did not fit any of the simple stories, not the ones told by people who called it a choice, and not the ones told by people who hoped for a single, clean genetic explanation. Sexual orientation sounds like one thing. Scientifically, it's at least three, and they don't always line up. The first is attraction, who a person is drawn to, emotionally and sexually. This is the core of what researchers mean by orientation, an internal pattern of desire that a person doesn't consciously select. The second is behavior, who a person actually has sexual contact with. And here's the catch, behavior and attraction can diverge sharply. In a prison, or a strict religious community, or any place where opportunity is constrained. Behavior and desire can point in different directions. The third is identity, the label a person adopts, gay, straight, bisexual, or no label at all. Identity is shaped by culture and language, which is why it varies so much across time and place. This distinction isn't academic hair-splitting. It's the reason so much older research was muddled. A study that measures behavior is measuring something different from a study that measures attraction. Much of the modern genetic work is careful to say it studies same-sex behavior, precisely because behavior is what you can actually record, while acknowledging that behavior is only a proxy for the deeper thing. And orientation itself isn't a simple switch. Alfred Kinsey argued back in the 1940s that it runs on a spectrum, from exclusively heterosexual to exclusively homosexual, with a great deal in between. Modern data broadly supports that picture. Most people cluster at one end, a smaller number at the other, and a real population sits somewhere in the middle. The first strong clue came from twins. Identical twins share virtually all of their DNA. Fraternal twins share about half. Like any siblings. So if a trait is genetic, identical twins should match on it far more often than fraternal twins. And for sexual orientation, decades of twin studies found exactly that pattern if one identical twin is gay. The other is significantly more likely to be gay than a fraternal twin would be. That tells us something real. Genes are involved. But the same studies deliver a second finding that is just as important, and often ignored. The match between identical twins is far from complete. When one identical twin is gay, the other very often is not, despite sharing essentially the same genome. Sit with that for a moment. To people, the same DNA, the same womb, often the same upbringing, and different orientations. That single fact rules out the idea that orientation is written purely in the genes. Something beyond the DNA sequence is clearly at work. The hunt for the gay gene. For years, researchers chased the idea of a specific gene, the so-called gay gene. Small studies pointed to regions of certain chromosomes. The results were suggestive, but underpowered and hard to replicate. Then, in 2019, came the study that settled the basic question. A team led by Andrea analysed the DNA of nearly 500,000 people, around 477,000 from the UK Biobank and the company 23andMe. It was, by far, the largest genetic study of same-sex behaviour ever done. They found 5 specific genetic markers reliably associated with same-sex sexual behaviour. Real signals, but each one with a tiny individual effect. And here is the headline. In the researchers' own conclusion, there is no single gay gene. Same-sex behaviour is polygenic, influenced not by one gene, but by many, perhaps thousands, each nudging the odds by a sliver. Taken all together, the measured genetic variance accounted for only a fraction of the variation, on the order of 8 to 25%. In other words, the genetic architecture of orientation looks like the genetic architecture of height, or personality, massively complex, spread across the whole genome, and never the whole story on its own. Before birth, hormones in the womb. If genes are only part of the answer, where does the rest come from? One of the strongest remaining leads points not to childhood, but to the months before birth. During fetal development, the brain is bathed in sex hormones, and the timing and level of that exposure shapes how it develops. The leading idea is that variations in this prenatal hormonal environment may influence the developing patterns that later express as orientation. It's a hypothesis, with real support, but the exact mechanism is still not pinned down. The single most reliable clue in this area has a strange name: the fraternal birth order effect. On average, a man's likelihood of being gay rises slightly with each older biological brother he has. The effect has been replicated many times across Western and non-Western societies. What makes it fascinating is what it is. It has nothing to do with growing up around older brothers socially. Adopted or stepbrothers show no effect. It tracks only biological older brothers, even ones raised in a different house, which means the effect happens before birth, in the womb. The leading explanation is the maternal immune hypothesis, the idea that with each male pregnancy, a mother's immune system may react more strongly to male-specific proteins, subtly influencing the development of the next son's brain. But here honesty demands a caveat, because the science demands it. The mechanism is a hypothesis, not an established fact. Direct biological evidence for the immune reaction is still thin, and some researchers have argued the birth order effect itself may be partly a statistical artifact. It is a strong, real, replicated pattern whose cause is still genuinely debated. It's a brain. What about the brain itself? In 1991, neuroscientist Simon Levy reported that a tiny region of the hypothalamus, an area involved in sexual behaviour, differed in average size between gay and straight men. It was a landmark, and it has been partially replicated. But it comes with a deep problem that applies to almost all brain research here. It's a snapshot. When you find a brain difference in adults, you cannot tell whether the difference caused the orientation or whether our lifetime of that orientation helped shape the brain. The brain is not fixed. Experience physically molds it. Cause and effect are tangled. So the honest summary of the biological evidence is this: genes contribute, but there is no single gene. The prenatal environment appears to matter, but the mechanisms are unproven. The brain shows correlations, but not clear causes. Every arrow points toward biology, and no single arrow explains the whole thing. The psychological evidence, myths and findings. For most of the 20th century, the dominant assumption was psychological. Orientation, people believed, was caused by upbringing, a distant father, an overbearing mother, some formative childhood event. These ideas were stated with enormous confidence. They have not survived contact with evidence. Take the parenting theories. Decades of research, including large studies of children, raised by same-sex couples, have found no reliable relationship between parents